Hey everyone, this is Jennifer Beamer, owner-operator of Excellent Diet Art by Science, and this is Fiber Talk episode number 18. And today we are talking about Gulf Coast native. Before we got into this, I wanted to talk about what I read here in the Fleece and Fiber Sourcebook about Gulf Coast native. They say it has a bit of an identity crisis because it's also called woods sheep, Gulf Coast sheep, common sheep, piney wood sheep, Florida native, Louisiana native, or scrubs sheep. And I would kind of agree. That's lots of different names that can be used for this particular sheep. Evidently, the Spanish brought over these sheep to North America and quickly realized that not all sheep is really well suited to the American Southeast. And so if you are a shepherd, you probably know this, but there's wool on the face and the legs of most sheep breeds. And for those particular sheep to thrive, they're not going to do so well in hot, humid climates. My partner is from Alabama, and he can attest to the weather down there. And I can't imagine being a sheep covered in all that wool and also extra wool on your face and legs. So the sheep that tended to thrive in these areas were much more hardy, and they could resist bugs more effectively by not having wool in certain key areas of their body to help them keep cool. And furthermore, they are really resistant to various types of parasites that affect other sheep, which makes them super good for this type of environment. Now, in that post-World War II era, there was a lot of other sheep breeds being brought into North America, which sort of put some pressures on these particular feral breeds. And as a result, the numbers of these flocks dwindled quite a lot, and then even the numbers of individuals in those flocks also became very small. So when I was visiting family in America back at the start of the pandemic, I got a chance to go to a knitting store, and I went in sort of not really intending to buy anything, but you know how it is, you go to a store with yarn, you're gonna leave with something. I did not anticipate leaving with wool. So it was a very small shop in Athens, Georgia, and I was not anticipating them having any kind of unspun wool. It definitely looked like a yarn shop, but they had this, and it was just plain white roving, and they were in approximately 2 ounces per ball, and they were all priced individually. So I pretty much got as much as I thought I should run away with, with leaving some behind in case someone else wanted it. So in total, I had 278 grams that I dyed in a test colorway. So I have since refined it, but it didn't hurt anything to dye it before spinning it. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with this project was sort of see how well it held up to dyeing, and then also how it spun. I dyed this wool a little while ago, and I have a video coming out where I talk about how I dyed this particular wool and some tips when you are dyeing wool. But essentially it says here that it takes colors really, really well and is an ideal candidate for dyeing. And I have to agree, because it did take the color very, very well. And even though the surface of it, it's not quite very shiny, it's got kind of a slightly dull sheen on the surface. It did take the color that I put on there very, very well, and I was really quite pleased with the result. In terms of the amount of lanolin, I really can't say too much because I did not process this from wool, but you got the sense from touching it that it had been scoured quite well. And in the Fleece and Fiber Sourcebook, it does say that there isn't a very high lanolin content. So if there is any vegetable matter, it should fall out really quite easily. During the spinning process, there were some stubborn bits that didn't quite fall out, but overall, it was exceptionally clean. And given that these types of sheep are probably unlikely to be coated and managed by a distance, like they will take care of themselves, and there's not as much hands-on engagement required for those basic maintenance things. So obviously, I'm fairly certain that most shepherds, especially for these conservation breeds, they aren't hands-off emotionally, but they probably aren't coating them so that their fleeces are pristine, because that actually requires a lot of effort. And if it's gonna fall out anyway, there's no real need. And again, if they are living in the American Southeast, they don't need extra protection. So yeah, so overall it was chemp-free. The amount of vegetable fibers in there was really, really minimal. It was pretty easy to spin, actually. And when I was doing my tour de fleece, which is why I dyed this and then spun this, so you can see some of the footage here, but also from that particular episode. Essentially, I was surprised at how shiny this wool actually was. And I mentioned this as sort of like a hint to get you guys to come over here to watch this particular video. But it's not as shiny as, say, Blue-Faced Leicester might be, but it isn't dull like I would expect something like Hampshire might be. And I know I haven't really talked about Hampshire yet, but I will. So yeah, I was a little bit surprised by how shiny the wool was. However, there is one thing to bear in mind when you are selecting your wool, and I want to talk about it right now. So you may be able to see it's fairly consistent in its gauge, but there are some spots that are a bit thicker than others. And this is the result of those really short fibers that can sometimes get into the fleece when it is a sheep that molts. So this is a naturally molting sheep. So what happens is you get sort of the fleece detached, it sort of lengthens the fiber, it's thinned out, and that sort of rises up from the animal. And there are these just real thin hairs spaced kind of around the body of the sheep that have still some connection. There's a little bit of a tether to the animal, so the full fleece hasn't completely sloughed off. And in the past, what people would have done is they would have seen this happen and then pulled the whole fleece part off, and then that would have been in lieu of shearing. Now, in the modern world, when we are less inclined to watch animals and go out and pull off the fleece from individual animals over the course of, you know, a few weeks, we kind of do it all at once. And so what happened, and I'm fairly certain this is what happened to this particular one, was the fleece rose and then that was shorn, so there was a lot of small pieces. And I don't know how they did their processing. It was definitely a mill-made roving, but there were some pieces that were exceptionally short and they caused spinning problems because you go from a staple length about 2.5 inches to something that's about this long. So a 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch. And even though it seemed to hold together in the roving just fine, I did find that it was quite a challenge trying to kind of like integrate those smaller bits. So there towards the end I was like taking parts of it off just because I knew I was going to weave with this and yeah, turn it into a blanket. I didn't want any weak spots in my yarn. So that is one thing to bear in mind that might be useful to you. Now, if you're hand processing a fleece like this, even if it's shorn, you will probably spend the time pulling those smaller pieces out, and I do highly recommend doing that because this is such a wonderful wool to spin. that it was a bit of a shame I encountered some of those short bits that caused me to have to stop and pull them out so that it didn't ruin my yarn. But I would say other than that, I was really quite pleased with how well it dyed and just how shiny the wool it was on the surface. And I would be happy to use this again in future projects, although I will see how it holds up to weaving, although I'm pretty sure that it's going to be fine. But in my Tour de Fleece episode, I did say that I was going to weave a blanket, and I don't have quite enough here. This is only 632 yards of the 3-ply. So what I've done is I've spun some other yarn. So this is Cormo that I'm going to use in the same project. I think this is going to soften this wool a little bit because according to the Fleece and Fiber source book, they can be between 26 to 32 microns. So this is what you might call like a medium coarse wool. So it would be good for things like jumpers, outerwear. You could maybe get away with a next to skin item if you found a fleece that was on the softer side. Again, having almost no kemp whatsoever, this would still be soft enough to wear next to skin if you didn't have any sensitivities and if you spun it so that it was soft and lofty. But otherwise, this one, there was some bits that were softer and some bits weren't. So by doing this 3-ply and kind of like mixing and matching the different consistencies, this is definitely representative of multiple different animals. So some of the plies are softer than the others, which means that overall it's going to feel balanced against the skin, but I think in combination with this Cormo, it's going to make the whole project overall feel a little bit softer. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a blanket. So usually if I'm wearing a blanket, I have something else on my legs. So it's not generally going to be touching my skin too much, but I also don't have sensitivities of this sort. But I was really quite pleased with how this project turned out, and I look forward to what it's like as a woven blanket. Have you ever used this wool? If you have, please post your insights in the comments below. If you've never heard of it before and you want to see more about it, it's pretty much restricted to North America, predominantly in the United States. So if you probably do a Google search, you'll find something. Again, I found this in Athens, Georgia, which makes sense because there's probably local flocks. So if you live in those southern states, you probably have had some experience with this wool, or at least awareness of it. And because it's a conservation breed, your money is contributing towards the maintenance of these particular flocks. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Like this video. If you want to support me directly, you can also go and check out my Patreon page to see what kinds of things I am producing there. And on my website, expertlydyed.com, or the same on Etsy. I very much appreciate all of your support, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!